Welcome back to another episode of Better Than I Found It, the podcast all things college golf. You're listening to Mike McGraw, the men's golf coach at Baylor. My guest today is Scott Fawcett, founder of Decade Golf and one of the world's most renowned experts on teaching golf course strategy. I think this interview is both entertaining and very informative. I know I learned a lot. I hope you'll enjoy the listening. Welcome back to another episode of Better Than I Found It, the podcast all things college golf. My guest today is an expert in his field. And as of 8 years ago, he was not an expert in this field. His name is Scott Fawcett. He is an absolute genius when it comes to numbers and course strategy. And I've really enjoyed getting to know Scott through the years. Scott, thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. I've listened to quite a few of your episodes and happy to have a conversation with a man I've respected literally from day one in this. It's funny because as we were talking just before, I did reach out to you back at that Royal Oaks tournament. You had tweeted something about just because a pin is off the edge of the green or tucked doesn't mean the middle of the green's harder to hit or whatever the phrasing exactly was. And I was like, that's a dude that's thinking this way. And obviously I know your track record as a coach. And honestly, to tip my hat to you, I sent you just a random cold email or whatever it was. And you were like, come on down. I was like, I was one of the best college coaches in the history of the game. And you literally spent a half a day with me. It was really incredible that it was basically a cold call. And you said, I like learning. Come on down. Really cool.
I really do like learning. And that's one of the reasons I've been wanting to have you on this podcast. You know, I've attended several of your seminars. I know a bunch of the players you've worked with. And obviously I love the information you have. So we're not going to give away everything you teach today. That's not what this podcast is about. I do want to tease people that may or may not know anything about your system, Decade. And I also want to tell them at some point during this podcast how they can get to it. But I do want to ask you a question because the summer 2014 is when I first found out who you were. And I was recruiting at the boys US Junior at Carlton Woods in Houston, just north of Houston. And you were caddying for Will Zalatoris. And Will was a kid that I had recruited when I was at Oklahoma State. Really good player, but whose game had flattened out. So without going too deep into this, because it's been documented before, but I just wanted you to tell my listeners how you met Will, how that all came about.
Yeah, it's a pretty cool story, honestly. So when Will moved from California to Dallas back in, when he was 9 years old, whatever that would have been, probably about 2007 or so. I was a member at Bentry Country Club, and his dad actually came in to be an asset manager for the Galleria Mall, which is somebody I had sold electricity to for a number of years through my electricity company. And when he got to Dallas, he actually called me in to have a first meeting and introduce himself and most likely say, hey, just want to let you know we've got our own guy. I'm going to go with him and fire me. Luckily for me, I had a Bentry logo on my shirt, and he was like, hey, do you play golf? My son's an aspiring junior golfer. And so I was like, well, I'm going to milk this for all I got. I'm like, yeah, I used to play on the Korn Ferry Tour. I'm the club champion, blah, 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 blah. And so I got to go out and play some golf with Will. And he was 9 or 10. And his golf swing literally looked exactly like it looks today. Like it's just a kid that just fell out of the womb and just has the ability to hit a golf ball. And so it was just kind of cool. Well, when he qualified for the US Junior at 12, 13, and 14, obviously that was eye-opening. And then he didn't qualify for it when he was 15 years old. And he was pretty beat down about that. And I was like, look, buddy, trust me, you've got a couple more years to do this thing. If you just keep working on what you're working on, obviously the putting was starting to give him some issues back then. But if you just keep doing what you're doing, I promise you're going to win this golf tournament, definitely compete in it. And so to actually have been able to be there and be part of it, because we talked about it quite a bit over those 2 years leading into caddying for him. So just a guy that, I went back and played on the Korn Ferry Tour in 2009 and 10. I should say part-time sparingly, but that was whenever he was really kind of starting to get to specialize in golf. So we did all kinds of chipping and putting and driving range games and played a decent amount. So it's just a kid that I've known since he was really young, and to have been able to accidentally create something that would really help him get over that hump was, again, it's just one of those like kind of surreal type stories where you just don't, you don't get that opportunity really ever in life. Like it's just been an amazing accidental journey into teaching some of the world's best players.
Well, also a great example of seizing opportunity. I mean, it was an opportunity for you, but getting, so you've kind of given the history of how you and Will got attached, but you still weren't doing the decade system. You still weren't in the world of golf strategy at this point. So tell me about Mark Brody's book, you know, pardon me, Every Shot Counts, and how that kind of got your mind going in a direction where you could help Will.
The genesis of everything. I started playing whenever I quit playing professional golf in 2002. I started playing a lot of poker here in Dallas. And actually, I met Chris Como playing in an underground poker game here in Dallas in like 2004. So he and I have been thinking about poker math. And in about 2006, 7, 8, I started just at least applying poker mindset, which is, you know, you're going to take bad beats. You're going to have guys hit 2 outers, you know, a 1 in 25 type shot on you, and you've got to be able to just move on. Otherwise, you're going to go on tilt, which is where I basically spent my entire professional golf career. So really, that's where I started applying the ideas of just poker math and mindset. And then once they started releasing some of the strokes gain statistics, which was in 2010 and 11, I really started thinking, I was already posting on this online poker forum called 2+2, just some of my strategy stuff with just very basic poker math being applied to golf. The idea of avoiding bogeys is easier than making more birdies, hitting drivers as far as you can. Like, you could see the genesis of it back in these threads. And then once in 2011, when they released strokes gained putting, I was like, wow, this is incredible. I can definitely tell you drive for show, putt for dough is not true anymore. And from there, really just getting access to the entire ShotLink database and the entire strokes gain database. Like you say, when Mark Brody's book came out in 2014, I had already started in the end of 13 and early 14, creating generic shot patterns. So basically creating, without getting too mathy, the standard deviations, which is just a measure of variance in size in regards to this, creating these generic shot patterns. And then once I had access to strokes gained, is basically how many strokes does it take to hole out from any given inch throughout the entire golf course. And once you have those two data sets, like, to me, the obvious use as a player, I mean, again, there's a bunch of math guys who are just like, look at all these Trivial Pursuit type facts and look at all these stats. I really don't find stats that interesting, as bizarre as that probably sounds. The obvious use of the data to me was to solve course management. And the reason I thought that was, there was an excerpt from Mark's book that came out where he was saying that Tiger was number 1 in the world because he hit it to 27 feet from 175 yards in the fairway. And Camilo Villegas was number 125 that year, and he hit it to 30 feet. And I was thinking, you've got to be kidding me. If 3 feet makes that big of a difference, people are for sure losing their cards just by being poor strategists. And so I started, and again, Mark would definitely rephrase, I think, that excerpt from his book and not have it quite that definitive as it was. But it made me realize that strategy is an extremely important thing. And it's what's so funny with all the arguing that I have to do on Twitter. If you ask somebody who are the 2 best course managers in the history of the game, your answers are going to be Nicklaus and Tiger. And it's like, if these guys are the best at it, and we can create a very simple way to teach essentially how they think their way around the course, it's just so obvious that it's important. And yet then I get people arguing that it's common sense. Then if it's common sense, there shouldn't be 2 obvious best at it. I mean, everybody's the same quality of adding 2+2. So there is no one better at somebody else than adding that. But there are people that are better at strategy and the resulting mindset as much as anything. Again, if you'd asked me in 2015, what's going on here, I'd have been like, I'm a genius. It's all the math, yay me. And now 7 years removed, I'm like, oh, it's actually all the psychology, which makes sense because I was such a lunatic when I was playing professional golf in my 20s. And it really is, there's certain things, once you understand the math, you just can't get mad at it anymore. And the best analogy of that I use is, if you and I were flipping coins, it's 50-50. If I flipped it and you guessed heads and it came up tails, you would not say, God, I suck at guessing coins. You literally wouldn't think twice about it. If you guessed wrong 7 times in a row, you would actually laugh. You would be like, this is unbelievable, man. And you would just keep guessing, and you wouldn't start questioning your guessing strategy. You just keep guessing. Well, an 8-foot putt on tour is 50-50. You go miss 7 of those in a row and you're going to throw your putter in the lake. And it's just not the way the game works, unfortunately. And again, that's what I think really the psychology is so much more of it than I ever would have understood.
Well, it would have been amazing to see where your career had gone had you had this. Uh, had this been created by you way back when? Because I mean, you obviously would have played better, and you would have probably kept your card.
I do. Again, I have countless, former mini tour players with me that say, man, I wish I knew this back then. And I do agree with that. I hit the ball really far. I definitely didn't have the yips. And now as a 48-year-old who can have a yip, I'm like, oh, I know what a yip feels like. I definitely didn't have that in my 20s. And my speed control and putting was my main issue, my speed control and my attitude. And so yeah, I do agree. Unfortunately for me, it would be cool to go back, but due to the beauty of our game, I've got a year and a half to try to play the Champions Tour. It sucks. There's only 5 spots every year, but I'm certainly planning on doing everything I can to get my game back in shape for that and try this again.
Well, that's good to hear. I was going to go back to the summer 2014 at that U.S. Junior at Carlton Woods. I watched you coach that week. You were a caddy for Will, but you were a coach that week, whether you like it or not. And you you'd prepared him well for the event, and then you coached him through the event. I mean, that's what coaches do. But I'm going to tell you a little story about something that occurred with me. And so I get to the 3rd hole of the first round. It's a par 3 over water. Pin was cut right up front. I mean, right against the water. And I watched 2 out of the first 3 kids in that group hit it in the water. And so I thought I'll watch a few more groups. I watched 2 more groups. So 18 total. Well, I watched 6 groups total, 18 players that day. And 6 of the 18 hit it in the water. Not one hit it over the green or in the back bunker. The next day, the pin was just opposite on the same hole. I watched the same 18 kids. So I waited until their tee time and watched them. And yeah, oh yeah.
It's brilliant.
And the pin is in the back, it's toward that back bunker, and 6 kids hit it in the back bunker. Not one kid hit it in the water. Now, would you please explain to me a front hole location, a back hole location, and why those kids did what they did?
I mean, we don't even have to give the kids a hard time for it. I say that on the tour. So where I always go when people start asking these front pin, back pin questions on the PGA Tour, this is a great data point that Lou came up with. From 161 to 180 yards in the fairway, PGA Tour players hit the green 71% of the time to back hole locations, and they only hit it 57% of the time to front hole locations. Literally the exact same length shot. And that's because we all are playing for this like 80th percentile perfect shot. And so those kids, they just pull out their laser, they laser the pin, and then that's the distance they're trying to hit it. What Decade would technically have you do is figure out the distance to the front edge and then add a certain amount of yards to that. And then that's the only thing you're thinking of, which in that scenario is probably going to be close to 10 or 12 yards. And most of those kids for sure just weren't adding enough. And so if like I hit an 8-iron 160 yards, I'm never going to accidentally hit it 100. I mean, even just 165, like it's just not going to happen because you can't over pure a golf shot. I mean, with wind and other factors, sure, it could happen, but I'm saying just in a vacuum on a flat driving range, not going to happen. But I will hit a whole bunch 155 and even 140, shoot even 145. And so yes, 160 might be your perfect 8-iron, but it is probably not your average 8-iron. And so those kids for sure just lasering the pin, and then it just, hey, that's a perfect 6-iron because it was a pretty long hole. And then you just slightly miss it a little bit. But what's cool is, as you can see, like on the PGA Tour, you get a hole like 13 at Riviera is the one that I use for my seminar all the time, where there's no trouble up front. That's where the tour players get themselves in trouble, and they come up short just constantly. Like it's honestly just comical how often. But then you get a hole like number 9 at Colonial where there's a lake short, and they only like 5 guys will hit it in the water out of 140-ish. And that's because, again, these guys aren't idiots. They're the best players in the world. So if you put a lake in the way, they know to hit it long. But with no lake in the way, they're trying to get aggressive and force birdies. The high school kids, the U.S. junior type player, they just haven't still figured out like, wow, I've got to hit it past this hole because of the lake. Whereas, tour players at some point, again, they're the best players in the world. They figured out the flip side of that. And I'm pretty surprised that they hit so many long, because again, typically the same problem would would exist. They simply they simply are benefited by the fact the pin's on the back, so they hit the green more often. But I would say those kids are probably still trying to force it all the way back to the back hole location. And so instead of the ones that hit it in the water short are probably the ones that had the perfect club in their hand but didn't quite hit it. And I'll say the ones that probably hit it long were the ones that were, well, I'm between a 6 and a 7, so I'm going to try to flight a 6. And then they accidentally, because of trying to flight it, took some trajectory and some spin off. So they basically created a flyer, which then made the club go actually their stock distance, because they just don't know how to play, for the flighted shot, and the fact that it's going to come off with typically less spin.
That's a good explanation. And I wish I'd have known it when I was watching it, when I was watching it in person. But I would say that I would agree with you. Tour players are not going to hit it in the water. They're going to hit it past the water. They're going to hit it to the middle of the green, to that front hole location, because they
and
know.
What's funny about that is, like, at Colonial specifically, since we're here in Texas, like that front hole location, historically, the one that's closest to the water, plays with one of the lowest scoring averages on the green, if not the lowest scoring average on the green every year. And again, it's because players are basically forced to not play like idiots. And what's funny is you actually can see, and I don't know if they're doing this consciously or not, but you can see that was always the final round hole location. And it's basically everybody in the field plays it correctly. And I don't know if they're doing this intentionally or not, but you can see the tour changing some of their historically consistent final round hole locations where they used to stuff it right against lakes, because again, it forces players to play correctly. It's not quite as interesting. And when you actually put the pin in what feels like a relatively benign position, they'll wind up playing more aggressively to it and making pedantic mistakes. And I mean, again, Cam Smith's shot on 12 yesterday was a somewhat obvious example of that at Augusta, where it's like, he's for sure firing that shot right at the pin. That shot, yes, he one-handed the finish, but it wasn't until after he saw where the ball was going. It wasn't like the swing, the hand just came flying off the club. I think the contact and the shot and everything was decent. He just had the wrong target. And that's what makes the game so hard.
It is a hard game. And okay, you just brought up Cam yesterday. Let's talk about Augusta this week. So I know you probably had well over 10 players there that you've worked with over time. And one of those is well documented, Willis Zalatoris, and Will had another great week. But talk to me about this. All these players you work with that are doing it for a living. How do you first come in contact with it? Is it all word of mouth? Because guys are always searching for answers. How do you get to all these players?
I don't know, honestly. It's funny because I have agents that reach out to me that follow me on Twitter. Like Keith Mitchell's agent reached out to me the week of the CJ Cup this year. I definitely have got a lot of word of mouth. Honestly, a lot of it goes back to when I first started doing this back in 2014, and when I would say really doing it in 2015 and 16, as far as teaching it. Como set me up with one of his veteran players to go down and work with them at San Antonio. And I went down there, and basically the guy for 9 straight holes told me, he's like, yeah, that's not really how I do it. Well, that's not how I see this. That's not how I do it. And I'm like, I know, I'm not here to learn how you do it. I'm here to teach you how I see it, and you can take it or leave it. I don't really care. But I drove down here from Dallas to show you how this works. And I realized quickly, I'm like, you know what? It's hard to tell a 27-year-old who's made $10 million you're doing something wrong, because they're pretty freaking cocky and they're like, no, I got it. Like, okay, cool. And I realized then, I'm like, you know what? I don't want to work with veterans. I'm going to focus on the college players. And in 4 years, I mean, I literally told people this. I was like, in 4 years, I'll graduate out onto the tour with them. And about 2020, 2021, I'm going to have 20, 25 guys out there that I'm pretty comfortable that I've worked with. And so that's really, it starts from college. So guys like Doc Redman and Maverick and, those guys I've worked with in college, and then they graduated and I helped them get through the Korn Ferry Tour. And so the vast majority of them is me just waiting out college players to finally turn pro. I will say guys like Stuart Sink, it's pretty interesting. Stuart's my exact age, and I've got this little thing that shows me sales as they come across every day, and sales list comes across for the day, and Stuart Sink's name's on it. I'm like, well, that's interesting. And so I emailed my program, like, is there anything you can tell me about like his IP address or anything? And he's like, yeah, it's registered to Ponte Vedra. I'm like, oh my God, it's probably the Stuart Sink. I didn't obviously reach out to him and say anything, but he won the next week for the first time in 12 years in Napa. And I was like, then I sent my program an email. I'm like, can you tell me if he watched any content? He gets in, he's like, yeah, they watched all of it. And when Stewart won the second time in Harbor Town, they had him on PGA Tour radio and they were asking him about Decade. And he said, well, if you go back to whenever I bought the app, I bought it just out of the app store, just like anyone else. I'm just a paying member of the public. But he said that, he had fired his caddy and he was going to have his son Reagan come caddy for him. And he's like, I was just searching around trying to find anything on course management that I could point in Reagan towards. So I found Decade, I bought it. And, I've got this little test that I have you do with a 9-iron early on in the app. And he's like, I went out and I hit 20 shots and my shot pattern was the exact size that he said it was going to be. And so I was intrigued, and he had Reagan watch all of the content. And then Reagan explained it to him. And he's like, I've just used it ever since. I mean, again, this is what's cool. You take a guy like Stewart Cink, who's won a major. He's won however many times on tour. He's been out there for 25 years. I mean, the guy's literally just been one of the best players on the planet for a quarter of a century. And it's not that he didn't understand how to play correctly. He played somewhat with Decade strategy, but once you understand the math behind it, you're going to commit to it a lot better because you just really understand these realities of shot patterns, the realities of strokes to hole out from any given area. And then rather than aiming, like traditionally, if it pins 4 yards from the left, these guys, again, they're not idiots. Most of them would aim 5, 6, 7 yards right of the pin with a 7-iron, but then they would hope they pull it. I really think that that's the main thing that I clear up in good players' brains, is this aiming away from pins and then hoping you pull it. Because again, you've just never sat on a driving range and thought, if I can pull this 15 feet, that's great. So now you're out on the golf course putting these wishy-washy swings on it where you're like not committed to the target. You're not trusting what we call the shotgun pattern. It's basically when a shot pattern is like a shotgun blast. That's the way it is if you hit 20 or 30 shots. You've just got this scatter plot. But any given shot on a golf course, you have that same shotgun, except only one BB comes out and you don't know which one is coming out. But you do have one that's on the right side and one that's on the left side. Again, back to Cam, I'm not going to rag on the guy the whole time, but if you aim at the correct target with the correct club, like by definition, about half the time you're going to push it a little bit. Those are going to be the shots where you have looks at birdie and, and whatnot on 12. And then the shots that you pull, like Scotty did, yeah, it's not ideal, but you can save par from over there. It's pretty hard to save par from the water.
You bring up a good point. When kids of this generation have been watching Tiger highlight reels for 10 years and they see that bunker shot with a 6-iron or 5-iron in the Canadian Open over water to the tucked right hole location, somebody needs to explain to them he was aiming 35 feet left of the hole and pushed it over there. And that could be said for every great player that's ever lived. And so what you teach, the players on tour should be living it. The young kids don't know yet. And so you're trying to help them. That's why you started in college. To me, that's
well, the challenge to add to that, the challenge that you face as a spectator is like Tiger. If every shot you've ever hit has been recorded, you can make a pretty cool looking highlight reel. Again, I'm not nearly Tiger's player, but caliber of player, obviously. But if you took my highlight reel over 20 years of just my best 50 shots, it would look pretty damn impressive. And as though I was firing at a lot of pins, but the vast majority of those great shots, Tiger simply was not aiming. It just wasn't aiming at the pin, period. And again, one of the images that I used to use to illustrate this idea, again, back in on number 17 at Sawgrass, that pin is always in the same spot on the back right. The tees are always in the exact same spot. It's playing 135. And it's just kind of comical because, when Tiger hit it, I think it was 2012, if I'm remembering my video correctly, he hit it to like 6 feet and the announcers are like, oh, what a shot under the gun. Well, if you think that's where he was hitting it, aiming, then in 2005 and I think 2007, he hit it in the water long left on the same pin. So if you think he hit it to 6 feet on purpose, then you also have to think he hit it in the water on purpose. You don't get to pick and choose. But if you look at the entire, all 10 or 12 shots that he's hit there in the final round throughout his career, in the shot link era, it's just a shotgun blast. He's got them all over the green. He's actually got 3 in the water because I think he missed the green right in the water once as well. It would be cool if you look back when he won the US Amateur there, and obviously he hit it in the fringe. It's just so interesting. Some of these shots, like, yes, he won 3 US Amateurs, but Steve Scott obviously could have easily won that. And if Tiger's ball doesn't catch the right amount of spin on 17 and then him make that putt, he loses to Tripp. Like, the dude, again, he's the greatest player by a mile, but the 2 US Amateurs that he won, he got extreme, or 2 of the 3, he got extremely lucky at some point late in the round to win the tournaments. They weren't like, I got lucky on 3. He got late on like the 35th hole of both of those that he won. Again, he still would have probably won them in playoffs or whatever you want to look at it, but winning requires luck, man.
It does require luck. I will say this: if you look at Tiger's last 2 victories at Zozo and the Masters, those last two that he's won, both of them looked as boring as could possibly be boring. He was hitting it to the center of those greens and 2 putting, and he made a few putts. I'm telling you, that's his strategy his whole career.
Well, 2019 is just, that final round is amazing. Like, it's as good of golf as you'll ever see it. And if you think about it, because there was never a giant Tiger fist pump on 7, he hit it to like a foot, because that front right hole location, same one they had yesterday, where you hit it, you got about a 20-foot circle you can hit it in, and it's going to go to like a foot. And so that was 1 birdie. And then he birdied the par 5s, which were just kind of 2 putts from the middle of the green. And then he just avoided bogeys. Like, it's just incredible. There was never a huge celebration because there was never anything to celebrate. It was just really solid, boring golf, like you say. And, you know, I understand when Nicklaus and Tiger say, I just want to be in the hunt and then let other people beat themselves. I don't know if that's really the way I see it. It's just like, no, you're just better at outlasting them. You're just better at golf than them. And yes, they do let the emotion of the moment take over their decisions. And then I guess that's where you're waiting them out, but it's not really like you're waiting them out to play bad golf. You're just waiting them out to do something dumb, because major championship golf is just really hard, and winning majors is hard, and on and on and on.
Well, let's talk about yesterday's winner, Scotty Scheffler. And we're recording this the day after the Masters. He did something on 15 that I want you to talk about when he went for that green in 2 with a 4-shot lead, 3 or 4-shot lead. Talk to me about that.
Well, I had been trying to find like an hour to drive the 10 minutes over to the gym. And I finally, when he hit it where he hit it, I thought he was closer to the trees. I didn't think there was any chance he would go for it. Obviously, he had a shot based on the shot he hit, but I for sure thought that he was going to lay that up. Not out of any game theory reason. I just didn't think he would actually have a shot. When I got there and I saw him just long, I thought that was a surprising place for him to hit a wedge. So you can't, DVR back the Lifetime Fitness TVs. So I pulled out my phone on YouTube TV real quick and clicked back because I wanted to see the wedge shot. And all of a sudden I'm like, where's the wedge shot? I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. He went for that. And I posted on Twitter, somebody asked about him going for it. And all I did was just comment like, that's the only way he can lose that golf tournament. I'm actually not saying if he should or shouldn't have gone for it, but going for it is for sure the only way he loses that golf tournament. You don't have to go back very far, like 12 months, to see Hideki make a triple there. And as Scotty illustrated on 18, it's never over until it's over. And if he makes a bone rattling triple there, you just never know what's going to happen. And this is what's just so interesting. I've got Brad Faxon, just, man, that guy hates me. It's something else, but he basically has his appeal to authority. I've played in 708 tour events and 11 Masters, but what do I know? Second guessing Scotty here is not appropriate. I'm like, I'm not even second guessing him. And honestly, if anything, I always, when people ask me about taking the circumstance of the tournament into play, which that's just considered game theory. Is there a game theory decision I can make here? I always say no, because golf is a game of imperfect information. You have no idea what everyone else is doing. But this is a rare situation where Scotty knows I've got a massive lead. I only have 4 holes to go. There's not enough time for anyone else to catch me unless I come back to them. Maybe this is a spot where he could have taken. He's definitely going to have a lower scoring average by going for that on that individual hole than he is by laying up, but he definitely brings in more big numbers. That is the utopian spot to actually apply game theory and lay it up, give up like 0.2 of a shot of value, but doing it for the greater good. Again, I would always coach against that if he was like the second to last group where you don't have perfect information, but he's got pretty damn good information right there that he's in a great spot. And so it's just hard because doing it in real time, again, Ted Scott's a guy I've worked with quite a bit. I definitely am going to ask Ted if I can have a little 30-minute interview with him, just because I want to ask about that. Like, what really went through y'all's head and decision there? I'm not saying it was right or wrong. Technically, it was probably the right decision. I just want to know what you really did weigh, because man, it was a bold decision. I know that much. It's an easy Monday morning second, quarterback, whatever the armchair quarterback decision. If he hits it in the water, long or short, you can just make a mess of that hole in a hurry. It's not easy.
I think golf historians will remember Seve's mess in 1986. He had that golf tournament won and knocked a 4-iron in the water second shot, and it just kind of unraveled from there. But anyway, so it's interesting, the Twitter wars you occasionally have because you have an opinion and people don't like your opinion sometimes, but I do respect it a great deal. So I'm going to ask you a question too. You mentioned drive for show, putt for dough earlier. 100%. That was literally something we grew up on, my generation. It's like, you can drive all you want down there, but by golly, you got to putt. So get me there. I'm 100% on board with this now, but I wasn't when I first heard it. First heard you were against it.
And this is honestly one thing I will say, there is a part of me that feels bad about some of the research that's been able to do, because I don't think the game's as interesting as it used to be. I mean, again, I tell people, if you don't like what I have to say, I'd stop listening to it, because you can't unhear it, and the game will be less sexy once you understand it. Again, as my buddy Humble Howard says, I stand for lower scores. Mm-hmm. I'm a tournament golfer. I'm not a historian. I'm not an artsy fartsy guy. I'm here to play tournament golf. I liken myself to a crew chief in Formula One. My job is to get this car to go as fast as physically possible while also staying somewhat safe. But so drive for show, I do think that this will be a fact over the next few years. Driving it far is disproportionately rewarded to the rest of the game. Hitting it far, like, it's great to be a good iron player. It's great to be a good chipper. It's great to be a good putter. But if you can hit it far, and obviously keep it in play, you have to be able to find it. Like, I feel like that goes without saying. This isn't about just slugging it as far as you can. It's disproportionately rewarded. I would much rather see somebody bomb it than be a great putter. Because there's just not, and again, looking at my own game, I hit it pretty far. And in hindsight, that hid so much of my deficiencies. The game, there's just not much left to it. Once you drive it relatively far and relatively straight, it's kind of hard to screw it up from there. And that's definitely what my game, in hindsight was all about. Again, back in the late 90s, I hit it 30 or 40 past basically everybody. And as a result, I was able to win a bunch in a relatively lackluster professional career, where I also missed quite a few cuts. And it's funny because I missed it for quite a few cuts because the rest of my game sucked, but also because I was playing so aggressively, because I'm literally like, again, Will's a much better player than me, so take this with a grain of salt, but I was basically Will when I was a junior golfer. I hit it really good. I putted kind of poorly. And as a result, I tried to force birdies with my approach shots. And it's a paradox. The worse you are at putting, the quicker you should try to be putting, because you will lag it for sure closer than you'll chip it. And again, this is just the stuff that the data just completely supports. So the idea of drive for show, putt for dough, again, yesterday, I get it. Scotty and Cam's short game and putting is what had them there on the leaderboard this week, but their long game is what has them on the leaderboard every week. And that's just, again, I do think the game isn't quite as interesting once you understand that, because you do start to realize that whoever's winning that week is just kind of getting a little bit lucky on the putting green, most likely, but you can't force that. All you can do is have as good a speed as you can possibly have, and then sit back and wait out variance to hold the putts, but just keep giving yourself and, looks, and more than anything, avoiding mistakes while you wait out a little bit of luck.
All right. That's good to know. Help me out with this. I have a problem with semantics. People talk about aggressive golf and conservative golf. And Jack Nicklaus always tried to play from point A to point B, and everybody thought it was so conservative. But by my definition, I think it was the most aggressive golf you could possibly play, because I think aggressive golf is doing everything in your power to shoot the lowest score. That's aggressive. And it looks conservative when Tiger does it at the Masters that year, and Nicklaus played a whole career that way. Do you agree with that, or can you reconcile that for me, aggressive golf versus conservative?
I just think that it's a misnomer. It's just, they're not even the right words, in my opinion, to apply to the game. There's mathematically correct and there's not. And honestly, both aggressive and conservative are not mathematically optimal. It is interesting because, people think that all I teach is middle of the green. I'm like, that's not even close to accurate. As you're closer, yes, we're going to get more aggressive. We're going to be aiming closer to pins, if you will. And as you're further and more hazards, then yes, you're going to get more conservative, aiming further away from them. But again, that's just mathematically correct. It's not as simple as just aiming at the middle of the green, because hitting 100% of the greens in regulation is not optimal, because it implies you're playing your wedges too conservatively. And the main thing that people need to use in order to get over this aggressive or conservative idea is number 18 at St. Andrews, that holds about 360, and that green is 52 yards wide. Middle of the green there would be really bad advice. The green's 52 yards wide. The flip side of that is number 10 at Pebble Beach is 500 plus yards from the US Open tees, and the green is only 17 yards wide. Middle of the green is actually bad advice on that hole too, because your target needs to be left of the center of the green. So I just really try to get rid of those. They're emotionally laced words. And again, that's what Brad Faxon, when he's just giving me a hard time on Twitter, I'm like, you're using emotions here to try to dictate a mathematical decision. Again, any decision you ever make in life, literally every decision you make is a math-based decision, whether you realize it or not. And my little canned joke for that is, something as basic as crossing the street, you are doing math in your head. Will I make it? 100% is what my answer needs to be. And if it's not, if I'm going to bring that down to 99%, it's because I'm in a hurry somewhere. And I've decided that hurry is worth a 1% death rate in order to make it on time. And so it is technically, when you're weighing two options, you're thinking of math. All Decade does is shine light on that math to where it's not emotional math. And then you can repeat the decision-making process. Like that's the key. And again, not to give Faxon too much of a hard time here, but Brad yesterday retweeted my thing about Scotty, where I said, I can't believe he went for that. And he's like, well, maybe, when you're out there, the heat of the moment, you do have to let the situation and emotions dictate. Like, no, you don't have to. But my whole thing is, in order to make an occasional override of Decade, an occasional override of optimal strategy, you have to be thinking about that constantly. Should I override here? Should I override here? You don't get to just pick on this one spot, I'm going to override it. You have to be looking for that constantly. And that's exhausting. And for every one time you do correctly override the math, which can be done. Again, yesterday, I do think Scotty probably should have laid up. I'm not sugarcoating that or trying to walk that back, but I'm also saying he did choose the lowest expectation route. But so much of it is just staying fresh. And again, back to Stuart Sink on that PGA Tour radio interview, his quote was along the lines of, you know what? I basically don't have to make decisions anymore on the course. The system makes the decision for me. And so the energy that used to be required to deliberate and make a decision like that, the system does it for me, which keeps me fresh. And I'm like, puts it in words better than my marketing department could have. That's something Brad is not giving any credit towards whatsoever. Is, man, if this system, it makes a pretty damn good decision pretty consistently, and it just takes that off your plate. Over 72 holes, you are finishing rounds of golf so much more energized, and you're just not mentally taxed, because the system just kind of makes the decision for you. Like, hey, aim it here. It's for sure going to be within a yard or two of the mathematically optimal target. And then you set it on autopilot, hit shots, move on. Autopilot, hit shots, move on.
So I showed your system pretty early on, probably 2016, when I showed it to a tour player I'm a good friend with. And he looks at it, he studied it, he asked me one or two questions, and then I kind of explained. Then he said, okay, that's just the way we play out here when we're playing well. When we're not playing emotionally, that's the way we play. It took him a few minutes to get to everything you had done there, and it was a simple, decade 101. But that's the simplicity of it. Under pressure, when the emotions are not your friend at all, you have a system that truly does take the emotion out of it.
I've never had a tour player to this day look at what I did and think that it's earth shattering. Right. I will say that they've all looked at him and like, yeah, I pretty much know that's right, but man, I don't do it.
Yep.
Again, that's the funny thing about it is like, again, once you've seen it and know it and heard it, you can't unhear it. So these tour players, again, this is where I get in trouble. Like there's, 12 to 18 people in this week's Masters I've worked with in some form or fashion. Literally 18 people in that field have told me thank you at some point. Now, the vast majority of them I haven't talked to in years, but I know that they still like the ideas are matriculating in there somewhere, if that's even a word. I feel like it is, but they're in there somewhere. And it just forces them to kind of commit to it a little bit better than they ever would have in the past. But now the flip side of that is, and again, going back to, I would have told you it's all the math, I'm a genius in 2014 and 15. With all due respect to the junior golfers and college golfers that are listening to this, I'm not saying you're idiots. I'm saying you don't have a fully developed brain yet. You do not have a prefrontal cortex. That is why you are soldiers at 18. And Coach McGraw and I, with our gray hair, we are not soldiers. We're looking like, hey, they're firing at you out there. I'm good. Let's send some kids in there. They don't know any better. That's the same thing, honestly, as decision-making to try to win a golf tournament. It's not obviously the heat of battle like a war. I don't want to be too disrespectful to actual soldiers out there, but in your head, it's going 1,000 miles an hour, and trying to make good decisions under pressure is just a really difficult thing to do. And again, what Decade basically does is take that need away. And so your prefrontal cortex, which is the last part of the brain to develop, it's really what separates us from other primates, I should say, because that's all we are too, is the ability to synthesize the information from all the different areas of the brain into one cohesive, good decision. That usually for guys finishes developing in the mid-20s, around 25. For girls, it's a little bit younger than that. Obviously, they're smarter than us. And so it's not even that I'm saying a 17-year-old kid's dumb. I'm just saying you literally don't have the ability to make a good decision. And so what Decade does is take that totally off your plate. And if a guy, again, like Stuart Sink, as a 48-year-old major champion, can be like, yeah, I just let this thing make the decisions for me. I see no reason a junior golfer shouldn't do the same thing, because at the end of the day, the math is no harder than 7 minus 2 minus 4. If you can pull that math off, you can run Decade. We've made it that simple.
That's excellent. And I agree with you. It's very, very simple. And our guys use, obviously, the system and use it. And I think they believe in it. So I'm hoping that over time it's going to pay huge dividends. I have another question.
Well, just to your point real quick right there, because I do catch so much grief on Twitter for like taking credit for players, good play. I'm really not doing that so people will think I'm cool or, wow, this guy knows all these tour players. I'm literally doing it so that way the junior golfer I couldn't say Bryson DeChambeau does this. He follows me on Twitter. It would be really a bad idea to just call out these players by name when they follow me on social media. And so the reason I'm doing it is so the junior golfer, the next Will Zalatoris, doesn't have to bang his head into the wall for literally 7 or 8 years trying to figure this stuff out. I mean, again, that's the most rewarding part of the Zalatoris journey, was having watched that kid be so frustrated and beat his head into the wall for literally 10 straight years, and then just being able to flip the light switch on for him. That's the point of when I talk about these players on social media, is to let these young players have some confidence. Like, this stuff works, man. That's what I'm going for. Exactly. Kind of like what you just said.
I think you're hitting on it exactly. And speaking of young players, at my golf camp last summer, I had a young player. He was very small, 5'6", didn't hit it anywhere. And I asked him, I said, how do you think you're going to compete, going forward in pro golf? Because I've seen the size of your dad. He's not a big man. And, you're not ever going to hit it very far. And he said, well, Coach, I'm just going to maximize me. In other words, he just basically said, I'll do everything I can to be the best I can. I can't do anything about being 5'6". So that question for you is this, Scott. Is there going to be room in pro golf for Corey Pavin, for Fred Funk, for Scott Verplank, for David Edwards, for Jeff Sluman? Do those guys exist going forward? If so, how can you help them exist?
They will. They're just going to have 175 mile an hour ball speed. I mean, I hate saying it. And again, like I say, I love, and I mean love, watching Bryson bomb it on tour. I think it is absolutely comical. That said, I think 144 guys doing it won't be very entertaining. And I do think there's at least 500 people on the planet that have the ability to get their ball speed over 190 and not putt terrible. That's your tour in the future. I mean, it just is. And again, this is where I do think distance is disproportionately rewarded in this game. And so if you ask me, would you rather have somebody who's a great plus 0.5 strokes gain putter or a great 190 plus, and I'm not even saying whatever their strokes gain driving is, or a great 190 plus ball speed driver? I'd take the 190 plus ball speed driver because I can teach that guy how to putt simply by working on his speed control. You cannot teach that mid 160s guy to get to 190. You can teach him getting the low 170s. There's a great player. He's a D3 player that I work with. He goes to one of the top math colleges in the country, and his ball speed's in the mid to high 170s, which I wouldn't have a problem with if he hadn't done speed training yet, but he's already started and been doing speed training for a while. And that's where he's at. That guy's not going to get to 180. He's kind of a smaller guy too. And again, I hate saying it to the guy. I'm like, yeah, I don't think you're going to make it in professional golf. I think you need to really focus on that math and just go get yourself a nice job and live Stuart Hagestad's life. That's a pretty damn good life. But I do think there will always be some sort of a spectrum of ball speeds. So let's say, and I don't even know what the low end of ball speed on tour is, but it's got to be, I'm sure there's Furyk and other guys that are 160 or something, but I would say realistically it's high 160s to mid 180s now. I think that shift, that width of the bell curve stays the same. It just shifts to 177 to 195. I do believe that. Again, I'm 48 years old. I had 2 elbow surgeries last year, and I'm already posting ball speeds in the low 180s. And I really haven't even started training for speed yet. I think I'm going to be able to get to 190. It's so interesting how defeated most people on social media are. They're like, so you think that these guys can all hit it further as they get older? Like, why not? I mean, I'm pretty sure Tom Brady's illustrated you can keep your body healthy for a long time. We're not talking about powerlifting here. We're talking about swinging hard. I do think that there's going to be so many guys in the 190s, and it's going to happen fast too. You see it, I'm sure, in college. There's a lot of guys at 190. I shouldn't say a lot, but there's some.
Well, I can remember being at the Thunderbird Junior Classic and watching Kyle Stanley when he was 17, and they said his ball speed was 174, and we were all just like off the charts, couldn't believe a 17-year-old had a 174, and they're all over the place now. It's just crazy.
Just all over the place. And again, that's where once you understand why, well, and again, like I try to play this smart guy on the internet. I was the worst at everything I teach, which I believe is why I teach it so well. Again, going back to the late 90s, early 2000s, when they first started coming out with the bigger headed, longer drivers, I would go hit a great big berth at 45 and a half. And I would kind of clank it all over the face. And I'd be like, I already hit my 44-inch, 975D or whatever it was, past everyone. What do I need to hit it further for? Like, that's literally the thing that makes my skin crawl more than anything else on this planet when I hear a player say it. And I said it myself a million times. Or I'll just get this 2-iron and play. Again, it's funny. Number one, I played in the 1999 US Open at Pinehurst. It's driver. There's 65 yards between trees, period. I was going to hit 2-iron, but comically, Harrison Frazier was like, I want to hit 2-iron there, but I'm afraid I'm going to shank it. I'm like, shit, you're right. So I went with 3-wood off the tee, which is the absolute only club it's not, but I hit the fairway and then I hit a 7-iron to 15 feet. I'm walking to 2T thinking I'm a genius. I just did that correctly. And it was literally the single worst club I could have hit off the tee.
Yeah.
It's just funny how you just because you're going to drop back off the tee doesn't mean you get to place it in the fairway. You still have to hit the fairway. And so often what I show on these par threes that I use on tour, number 15 at Innisbrook, the green is 28 yards wide. The hole usually plays about 200 yards and they don't hit the green. I'm making up a number here, but I think it's about 75% of the time. So here they are on a 28-yard wide fairway is big. You take number 6 at Winged Foot, the drivable hole, and Peter Kessler saying only an idiot would hit driver on that hole. That hole at 220 off the tee, the fairway was 22 yards wide. They literally won't hit that much more than about 65% of the time with iron off the tee. You might as well just ship it up and around the green. That's one of the major changes we did with Will at the Texas Amateur, rather, at Brook Hollow here in Dallas, was I just got him to hit driver basically everywhere. Just send it and we'll get up there and figure it out. But by laying up, you're just kind of giving up. You're not trying.
Yeah. I told a story on a podcast here recently with Chris Hack, University of Georgia coach, and they won the 1999 NCAA championship because of the 16th hole at Hazeltine. They all hit driver, and the worst it was going to happen, it might get in this little creek just left of the green, drop, chip on, make your par putt or make a bogey. We were trying to lay back with 2 and 3 irons and we made quads. We counted a triple and a quad that week on that hole. So we didn't know about Decade in 1999, or we'd have been hitting driver.
That's brilliant that he figured that out, though. Honestly, I mean,
oh, it was great. It won him the national championship that year. I promise you, that hole won the championship for him. But it's interesting. I think this young boy that was at my golf camp last summer, I think that would be a hard thing for him to hear, but it's the truth. That's just the way the game's going. Unless they dial the ball back or do something, the game is there. And he's going to have to maximize, like he told me, Coach, I'll just maximize me. I like that. Thought it was great. He does have to do a lot of maximizing.
Well, I mean, again, like, I'm a pretty big dude. I'm 6'1" and 220. I'm pretty strong. I would love to play in the NBA, but they told me in about 7th grade, it's not going to happen for you, man. That's one of the main reasons I started playing more golf. I do hate it because, again, like this one kid that I was referring to, I love this guy. He is an amazing young man, but I don't think he would possibly have a single chance in the world in making it as a tour player, which I didn't say that to him, but I basically said that to him. And if you're listening, buddy, you know what I mean? Again, I do think there's a chance. I mean, like a 1 in 100 or a 1 in 1,000 chance the rest of your game could be good enough. But what my point with saying, man, I don't know, is if your max ball speed is going to be 172 or 4, in 5 years, that's going to be a problem. Everything else about your game has to be basically perfect. And as a result, I'm like, I just wouldn't bother trying. Not when it's not fun. Another thing that I'll say, and you've seen enough guys try to play professional golf, it's not that fun, man. It's a beating. I mean, it's even where I like jokingly say right now, like, I want nothing. And I literally mean nothing more, family and kids, whatever caveat aside, professionally, both golf, my electricity company, or playing, I want nothing more than to play on the Champions Tour in 2 years. That said, when I actually also do like a visualization exercise of okay, Scott, put yourself out on the road in 3 years for 3 straight weeks when my girls are 10 and 14. Now, does that look fun? And I'm like, oh, not really. I mean, I don't need to do that. I want to do it. And I think that's where too many people, they get caught up. I want to play on the PGA Tour. Cool. But have you really thought through what it looks like? Because, man, more guys than not on tour are not real happy people. That's also part of the personality of what it takes to make it on tour. Unfortunately, they're pretty independent people, if you will. And then you throw them out on the road. It's not a good place to be, but man, making it on tour is great. Getting to the tour is not great.
Wow. Good advice. Well, listen, I've got one more question for you, but before we go to that question, can you tell me or tell my listeners how people can access Decade, the app? How do they get to you?
I mean, at this point, luckily, just Googling Decade Golf will pretty much get you anything you need to go. We've just set up the domain for easedecade.golf. And from there you can find it, or if you just search Decade Golf on your phone, you'll find it. I do tell most people that average, 75 to 80 or higher, just start with the foundations version. That's our kind of more introductory version. It just breaks up the content. I mean, there's 10 plus hours of tutorial content in there. It's a lot. And I do, with all due arrogance, I do think it's pretty entertaining. Like if you're the kind of person that would even remotely consider signing up for a golf strategy and statistics app, like if that sounds like a decent idea to you at all, you're going to love it. I mean, it's going to be right up your alley. And so I really do, for the less experienced player, with foundations, we just try to slow it down where you get a little bit of content every month, because I do think too many people will just binge watch through it because they get a little excited and then they don't really retain anything. So I try to slow it down. The elite version, if you're a junior golfer who's in the 70s or on a trajectory to be in the 70s soon, the elite's fine for you. But then the only other thing that I'll add to that is we have free yardage books in the app where you can take any course on the planet. You download a yardage book. So if you are a tournament player and you do buy yardage books, the app more than pays for itself. I mean, it's literally, it actually has an ROI if you play in more than 3 or 4 golf tournaments a year.
Very good. Very good. Well, thank you for that. All right. My last question for you today, Scott, and I do appreciate you coming on and giving us a lot of wisdom and different things that I think give people food for thought and, maybe actually help their game. So, but finally, what is your best piece of advice you'd give a 14-year-old who wants to play college golf and beyond? If you, coming from your perspective, had one thing you would tell them, what would that be?
That's a tough one.
2 things, maybe?
Well, I'm going to just give you what I'm going to do. I mean, again, this is what's funny. Over the next 5 years, I plan on trying my hardest to play on the Champions Tour. This is what I'm going to do. And so you can kind of take it that I would believe that that's the best for everyone. For me personally, meditation, a strong meditation routine is my number one priority. You can literally see Tiger in 2019 meditating throughout that entire round of golf. And I've known for a while kind of what he did for a meditation routine. So the day before Tiger's wreck last year, he was actually out in LA doing these on-course playing lessons with celebrities. And he was with Jada Pinkett Smith the day before the wreck last year. And about halfway through their 9 holes, she said, it really looks like you're playing in this meditative state out there. You're just so focused and present and calm. It really looks like you're meditating. And Tiger's response was, yeah, that's exactly what it is. It's a meditative state. And I was like, wow, that's incredible. He finally actually said it out loud, which will help me sell this to younger players. But then about 5 or 10 minutes later in the segment, they're just having like a snack at the turn. And she's like, well, let's talk about your hobbies. What are your number one hobbies out there? He's like, I like to free dive. And she's like, oh, really? Well, like, how deep do you go? And he said, like 80 feet. And she's like, oh, wow, you're a real free diver. Like, that's impressive. And she's like, why? And he says, well, I mean, it gets back to that meditative state that we've talked about before. You've got to be able to control your breathing, control your mind, control your thoughts. If something goes wrong, you'd better be ready to respond to it, not react emotionally. And I was just like, oh my God, that's incredible. And then she followed up that with saying, well, like, when did you start? And he just kind of snickered. He's like, I mean, when I was born. And I was like, there we go. That's what I needed him to say in public. Like, I've kind of known that for a while, but I couldn't really use it just because I don't want to get people in trouble for talking about him. But hey, you just said it in public, man. And he goes on, his mother's Buddhist background and his dad's Green Beret background. So the number one thing, I do believe that there's a guy named Sam Harris. His meditation app, Waking Up, is amazing. Headspace is another amazing app. 10% Happier by Dan Smith, I think it is. There's a number of great meditation apps out there. And the point of it is you have to have something to anchor yourself to when your mind starts racing. When I tried to meditate when I was younger, would always get mad because I'd be trying to meditate and then my mind would still be racing. I'd have all these thoughts and I would think I'm failing at meditating. The point of meditating is not to have no thoughts. It's to recognize the ruminating, recurring thought pattern and stop that before it spirals out of control for 20 or 30 minutes. So back when I was in my 20s playing professionally, I mean, literally daily, I would just be like, if I could go back 30 minutes, I'd do that differently. Well, that's not how it works. You've got to be able to be calm enough and present enough to recognize when it's going off the rails And so it's hard because, and again, so much of like Decade, the content and tracking stats, if you feel like you should have shot lower every round, well, what are you doing to correct those problems? I would just laugh about everything I did dumb that day at the Outback Steakhouse and then move on, never think about it again. The point of meditation and the point of doing some stuff away from the course is those are the shots you're working on, and those shots won't just magically fix themselves. So number one is for sure meditate. And then for me, it's going to be speed with lag putting. Again, I love Will like a son, but obviously he struggles a little bit on shorter putts. But last season, he was only minus 0.06 strokes gained putting. He was basically dead on tour average. And while everybody would think, God, he's just a terrible putter or whatever, like tour average is pretty unbelievable, man. And that's because he focuses almost exclusively on his speed control. And what I texted him actually yesterday was, honestly, I thought your speed was great all week. It just needed about a foot more pace. I do talk about trying to leave more putts short quite often, which I do think the first two rounds Will left a few too many short. And so people would be like, hey, his speed was better. Like, no, his speed was great. It was all over the hole. He tapped in so much. It was unbelievable, but they could have just been about a foot further. And so then the tap ins that were only 6 or 8 inches past the hole now would have been a foot and a half past the hole. Still going to make those, but the few putts he did leave short would have at least gotten around the front edge. So speed with lag putting and then hitting it as far as you possibly can. I mean, those three things are, in my opinion, basically all there is to golf.
Great advice, Scott. Thanks so much for that. And honestly, thanks for coming on today. You gave me a lot today. In fact, I learned a lot today. So it's
Beautiful.
Always a win-win when that happens.
Well, I will praise you and tell any golfers that are out there and fortunate enough to get recruited by you and Baylor that people ask me all the time, who are some of my favorite coaches, and you are on the short list of 3 or 4 that I name. If you want to go learn from a guy who takes it serious and is going to take it serious until they stick him in the grave, this is your guy. I mean, it was just amazing that first time I went down there. I said something and you're just like, hold on a second. And you reached to your stack of 30 notebooks and you pulled out one from the middle of it and flipped straight to the page for this scenario I was describing. I'm like, wow, dude, that was impressive. I know people say to journal, but you actually do it. And apparently you actually review it because you knew exactly where you wanted to go. That's how you learn from your experiences in the past and pour it into the future. And every time I get emails daily when people say, man, thank you for everything. I've really, I played my first tournament, blah, blah, won my first tournament. I always respond, make sure and journal succinctly the good and bad you were doing. And I say succinctly, so that way you'll actually review it often and turn it into habits. Maverick, when he first turned pro, he was literally writing these 10-page journal entries every single day. And I'm like, do you ever review that, man? That's a lot. And he's like, no, I just get it all down on paper. And I was like, here's what I would suggest. Make it more succinct, bullet pointed if you have to where you can review it. Now, Maverick's obviously a really smart dude, so he probably can retain it all. But for the normal person, journaling a bunch of bullet point type stuff so you review it and turn it into habits. This worked, this didn't work, because eventually it's not going to, Scheffler, you're not going to win 66% of your starts for the rest of your career. You're going to struggle at some point. Having a concise journal of what he's been doing for 2 months now will for sure help him in the future.
Yeah. Who better to take advice from than the person that did it, right?
If you can't trust yourself, I mean, that's where people sometimes they get mad at me in the content. They're like, man, you're so blunt. I'm like, well, if you're mad, all I'm doing is literally talking to myself. I attack the content from the angle of what would I have to do to convince my 20-year-old self that this is how you do it. I'm talking to myself. Exactly what you just said. Your journal entries are for your use. I mean, Marcus Aurelius didn't realize that Meditations was going to be turned into one of the more famous books in the world. He was just writing notes to himself. Here's what I should do this day. And again, journaling is probably the most important habit. Actually, going back to what the question a second ago, that's probably the most important habit, as long as you're journaling the right stuff.
Well, thank you for saying that. I tell kids that all the time. And journal something you'll go back and review, and it's for your use in the future is what it is. So,
yep.
Well, Scott, this has been a blast. Thank you so much for coming on Better Than I Found It today. And I enjoy following your career, so I'll continue to do that.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. I appreciate it.